Flames swallowed the private jet just seconds after it crashed beyond the airport fence. Smoke blackened the sky, while terrified passengers screamed for help. Among the crowd frozen in fear stood Ethan Cole, a struggling single father, who had been publicly fired 3 months earlier by ruthless billionaire CEO Victoria Hale, the 35-year-old tech queen who once called him replaceable. He should have walked away. Instead, hearing a little girl cry from inside the burning wreckage, Ethan sprinted straight into the fire. The world watched in shock as the man she destroyed risked everything to save the woman who ruined his life forever. Ethan Cole was 38 years old, and he carried the weight of a life that had never once been easy. He had studied aerospace engineering on a partial scholarship, working night shifts at a diner to cover what the grant didn't, sleeping 4 hours a night through 4 years of college, driven by the simple belief that hard work was its own kind of justice. That belief had carried him far enough: a solid career, a small apartment, a woman named Sarah, who laughed too loud at bad jokes and made him feel like the world had finally balanced out. Then came the Tuesday evening 5 years ago when a distracted driver ran a red light on Maple Avenue, and everything balanced disappeared in a single second of screeching metal and broken glass. Sarah didn't make it. Ethan did, and so did their daughter, Lily, who was 3 years old and asleep in her car seat, and somehow mercifully, impossibly completely unharmed. He spent the first year after Sarah's death functioning on autopilot, waking at 6, packing Lily's lunch, dropping her at daycare, sitting at his desk and doing the work, coming home, cooking dinner, reading bedtime stories in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. He grieved in silence because Lily needed stability more than she needed a father who fell apart. That was the deal he made with himself. Hold it together, keep going, be enough for her. By the time Lily turned 8, she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's fearless laugh. She had also developed mild asthma, a condition that required 2 inhalers and a monthly prescription that cost more than Ethan would ever say out loud. The apartment they shared on the east side of the city was small: 2 bedrooms, thin walls, a kitchen window that overlooked a parking lot, but Ethan had hung Lily's drawings on every available surface until the place felt alive. She drew constantly, planes, mostly because her father worked on them, because she believed with the complete certainty of an 8-year-old that her dad built the best machines in the world. He worked for Hale Aerospace, a company that had grown in 5 years from a mid-tier defense contractor into one of the most aggressive players in private aviation. The job paid steadily, offered decent benefits, and kept Lily's prescriptions covered. Ethan was not a man who needed luxury. He needed enough. And for a while, enough was exactly what he had. Victoria Hale had built Hale Aerospace into a multi-billion-dollar empire before she turned 35, and the financial press could not decide whether to celebrate her or fear her. She was photographed at international summits in tailored white suits, flanked by lawyers and advisors, eyes sharp behind whatever expression she had chosen to wear that day. Business magazines called her visionary. Former employees called her something else entirely. The tabloids had settled on a nickname that stuck: the Ice Queen Billionaire. It was not entirely unfair. Victoria had a talent for reducing complicated human situations into simple equations: profit, loss, liability, leverage, and she moved through the corporate world with the precision of someone who had never once second-guessed a decision. She did not yell. She did not threaten. She simply decided, and the people around her scrambled to make her decisions real. She was preparing to launch Hale Aerospace's most ambitious project yet: a line of ultra-premium private jets designed for international government contracts, backed by a $5 billion deal with 3 foreign defense ministries. The launch was scheduled for the end of the quarter. The prototype, designated the HA-7, was ready. The press conference was booked. The deal was practically signed. It was during a routine structural review that Ethan found the problem: a fault in the auxiliary fuel line routing near the starboard engine housing, subtle, easy to miss, catastrophic under high-altitude thermal stress. He documented it carefully: 47 pages of technical analysis, cross-referenced against 3 published incident reports from similar designs. He submitted it through the proper internal channel on a Thursday morning, flagged as urgent, and waited. By the following Monday, he had received no response. He escalated. He sent the report directly to the senior engineering director, then to the VP of operations, then, when both remained silent, to the office of the CEO herself. He was told he would be contacted. He was contacted the following Wednesday by a junior assistant, who informed him that his presence was requested in Miss Hale's office at 9 the following morning. Ethan went home that night, helped Lily with her homework about the water cycle, read her 2 chapters of a book about a girl who discovers a hidden dragon, and told himself that tomorrow would be fine, that the company would listen, that doing the right thing would be enough. It was not enough. Victoria's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the city sprawling below like a circuit board. She was already seated when Ethan arrived, and 4 senior executives lined the wall behind her like a tribunal. She did not offer him a chair. He sat anyway. He laid out his findings calmly, methodically, the way he had rehearsed them walking through the fuel line fault, the thermal stress projections, the historical incident data, the specific conditions under which the failure would most likely occur. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. When he finished, the room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Victoria Hale folded her hands on the desk and looked at him the way one might look at a minor inconvenience. She said the fault was within acceptable parameters and had already been reviewed by the company's contracted safety team. She said the launch was proceeding on schedule. She said that internal dissent at this stage of a critical project was not just unproductive, it was dangerous to the company's future. And then she said the thing that Ethan would hear in his memory for months afterward, the thing that cut through every professional layer he had built around himself. She said, in front of 4 executives and a glass wall and a city that didn't care, "People like you are why companies fail." 2 security officers appeared within minutes. Ethan's badge was deactivated before he reached the lobby. His personal items were boxed and left at the front desk. By noon, the entire company knew. By evening, his name had been quietly removed from every internal system. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building with a cardboard box and the particular stillness of a man who has just had the ground removed from beneath him. The weeks that followed were a lesson in exactly how alone a person can be. He applied to 12 companies in the first month. 3 responded. 2 interviewed him. None offered a position. The aerospace industry was smaller than it looked from the outside, and Victoria Hale's influence was larger than anyone without power ever fully understood. The word spread without anyone having to say it directly. Ethan Cole was a problem. He was the guy who tried to blow up a billion-dollar launch. Nobody said that aloud, but nobody had to. The doors closed quietly, one after another, until there were no more doors to try. He picked up a delivery job within 3 weeks, driving for a logistics company that paid by the mile. He worked nights mostly, after Lily was asleep, driving routes through the dark parts of the city while his phone mounted on the dash showed him the next address. His hands, which had once drafted structural load calculations, now lifted packages from loading docks and carried them up apartment stairs. He did not complain about this. He was not built for self-pity, but there were nights, long stretches on empty streets at 2 in the morning, when he would pull over in a parking lot and sit in the quiet and feel the full weight of the distance between where he was and where he had believed hard work would take him. Lily knew something was wrong because children always know, even when adults believe they are hidden. She stopped asking for the new sneakers she had mentioned once in September. She ate whatever was in the refrigerator without comment. One evening, while Ethan was sorting through bills at the kitchen table, she appeared beside him and set something down without a word, a small red envelope, the kind from the dollar store, sealed with a sticker shaped like a star. Inside was $14.37. Her entire allowance savings from the past 2 months, and a folded piece of paper that said, in her looping 8-year-old handwriting, "For us, Daddy. Love, Lily." Ethan held the paper for a long time. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close to where it needed to be. He did not cry in front of her. He waited until she was asleep. Then he sat in the dark of the kitchen and let it happen, quietly, with his hand pressed flat over his mouth. A man trying to keep his grief small enough not to wake his daughter. The next morning, he made her pancakes and helped her practice her spelling words. And when she asked him if everything was going to be okay, he looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, because we take care of each other." He believed it because he had to. It was the only thing that kept the equation from collapsing entirely. He told her something else that week, something that came out during a quiet dinner when she had asked why he still delivered packages even when it was raining outside. He said, "Good people help others even when life is unfair." Especially then. Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded as if filing it away for later. She had her mother's quality of listening, really listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. Ethan noticed that she had started drawing something new in her sketchbook, a figure in a uniform standing in front of a large airplane, one hand raised toward the sky. She showed it to him one evening and said, "That's you, Daddy. You're making sure it's safe." He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he pinned it to the wall beside her other artwork, in the place of honor above the kitchen table. The hardest part of those months was not the financial pressure, though that was constant and grinding and required a kind of daily mental arithmetic that eroded something in a person over time, calculating whether the gas or the prescription came first, whether the internet bill could stretch another week, whether there was a way to make the numbers work that he hadn't thought of yet. The hardest part was the professional silence. Ethan had spent 16 years building expertise that was real, that mattered, that had kept machines in the air and people alive. He knew things that most people in his field were still learning, and now that knowledge sat unused inside him like a language no one in his current life spoke. He would be moving packages through a freight dock at midnight, and his mind would drift, unbidden, to the aerodynamic problem he had been working on before the termination, a solution for reducing drag coefficient at cruise altitude through modified nacelle geometry, and the solution would arrange itself clearly in his thoughts, complete and elegant, and he would have nowhere to put it. He started writing things down in a notebook he kept in the glove compartment. Not for any purpose, just to keep the part of himself that thought in structural load diagrams from going entirely dark. He watched the HA7 promotional videos on his phone sometimes, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with the professional attention of someone who could not stop seeing what was wrong. The fuel line routing was visible in 2 of the promotional shots, just barely, in the background of a segment about the engine housing. He knew what he was looking at. He paused the video and stared at the still frame for a long time, the way a surgeon might look at an X-ray that showed something that should not be there. He filed a formal complaint with the Federal Aviation Authority in October, attaching his original 47-page report. He received an acknowledgement email 14 days later. He did not hear anything further. He still followed the aviation news. Old habit. And so it was that on a Tuesday afternoon in November, while parked outside a strip mall waiting for his next delivery assignment to load, he opened the news on his phone and saw the headline, "Victoria Hale's HA7 loses contact shortly after takeoff." His stomach dropped before his brain caught up with the words. He read the article twice. The jet had taken off from a regional airfield 40 miles east of the city, carrying Victoria and a small team of executives en route to a signing ceremony abroad. Contact had been lost 4 minutes after departure. Emergency services had been dispatched. There were no confirmed casualties. Location of the aircraft was unknown. Ethan sat in the parking lot for a full minute without moving. Then his phone lit up with the next delivery address, and out of some mechanical instinct, he pulled out of the lot and drove. The address on his screen took him north toward the industrial corridor near the old freight airport. He was 3 minutes from the destination when he saw the smoke, black and massive and rolling up from somewhere beyond the tree line, the kind of smoke that does not come from a building fire or a brush fire. He knew immediately, the kind of knowing that arrives in the body before the mind can process it. He pulled off the road and got out of the car. Through a gap in the fence line, across 200 yards of scrubby grass and gravel, he could see the wreckage. The HA-7 had come down just beyond the airport's perimeter. Part of the fuselage was intact. Part of it was not. Orange flame licked at the undercarriage, and the auxiliary section, the starboard engine housing, exactly where he had identified the fault, was fully engulfed. Police units were beginning to arrive, blue lights strobing at the far end of the access road. A small group of airport workers stood frozen 50 yards from the fence, watching, doing nothing, because there was nothing to do from this distance except watch. And then Ethan heard it. Thin, reedy, barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. A child's voice, crying. His body made the decision before his mind could apply any logic to it. He remembered what Victoria had said to him. He remembered the boxed belongings on the sidewalk, the closed doors, the nights in the parking lot at 2 in the morning, his daughter's red envelope with $14 inside. He remembered all of it in the span of a single breath. And then he climbed through the gap in the fence and ran. The heat hit him at 100 yards out, physical, pressing, the kind that pushes back against you like a wall. At 50 yards, the smoke was thick enough to sting his eyes. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and kept running. The emergency door on the forward cabin section was warped from the impact but not fully sealed. He found the handle by touch, braced his legs against the fuselage, and pulled. The engineering knowledge was in his hands before it reached his thoughts, the specific angle of force required, the resistance point of a thermally compromised latch mechanism. The door gave. He went in. The interior was chaos. Overturned seats, overhead panels torn loose, the smell of burning fuel and electrical wire thick in every breath. 2 passengers were conscious and mobile near the forward section, a man with a bleeding gash across his forehead, and a woman clutching her left arm. Ethan grabbed the man's collar, pointed at the door, and said 2 words, "Go. Now." Then he moved deeper into the wreckage toward the sound of crying. The cabin narrowed toward the rear. The smoke was heavier here, the temperature rising by the step. He found the child, a girl, perhaps 7 years old, belted into a rear-facing seat. One leg trapped beneath a collapsed overhead bin. She was looking at him with eyes enormous with terror and relief in equal measure. Her name, he would learn later, was Emma. She had been traveling with her mother, who had already made it out through the forward section before Ethan entered. Emma had not known this. She had believed, in the particular aloneness of a child surrounded by fire and smoke, and the sound of metal contracting in heat, that she had been left behind. Ethan talked to her while he worked calm, steady, the voice he used when Lily was sick and frightened, telling her his name, telling her he was going to get her out, telling her to hold on just a little longer. He said, "I've got a daughter about your age. She's going to want to hear about how brave you were today." Emma stopped crying. She pressed her lips together and nodded, the way a child does when they decide to be brave because someone has said they can. He freed her leg in under 2 minutes, lifted her, turned back toward the door. That was when he found Victoria. She was in the forward cabin section, slumped against the starboard wall, one leg pinned beneath a collapsed seat frame, a gash above her right eye bleeding steadily into her collar. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder. Her face, always controlled, always composed in every photograph he had ever seen, was stripped down to something raw and frightened and completely human. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else entirely. Disbelief, recognition. Her mouth formed his name before any sound came out. "You?" He set the child down, steadied her, and pointed her toward the door. "Straight ahead, keep moving, don't stop." He turned back to Victoria. The seat frame holding her leg was heavy, a full structural member, not just a panel, and the heat on his right side was becoming critical. He could feel the paint blistering on the fuselage wall 6 inches from his shoulder. He looked at her. She was staring at him with an expression he could not fully read, something between shame and incomprehension. She said, "Why are you?" And he said, "Don't talk. Push when I lift." He gripped the seat frame and drove upward from his legs. The metal shrieked. On the 3rd attempt, it gave enough, and he grabbed her arm and pulled her out from under it and got her upright. She couldn't bear full weight on the trapped leg. He took it. They were 6 feet from the door when the port side window blew. The pressure wave hit him from the left, and Ethan stepped into it, turning his body, putting his right side between the blast and Victoria's face. The heat across his forearm and hand was immediate and complete. He did not stop moving. They cleared the door. They cleared the fuselage. They were 30 yards across the gravel before his knees buckled, and he went down on one hand, and the pain finally arrived loud enough to hear. Behind them, with a sound like a struck bell amplified 1,000 times, the rear section of the cabin collapsed inward. A column of fire rose from the wreckage. Emergency vehicles were converging now. Paramedics running toward them across the gravel. Ethan sat on the ground, left hand pressed against his burned right forearm, and breathed. Victoria sat 2 feet away, watching him with an expression that had no category. First responders reached them, voices, questions, hands checking for wounds. Ethan looked up at a paramedic and said one thing. "My daughter. Is she okay? Her name is Lily. Someone needs to call." They put him on a stretcher. He was still talking about Lily when they loaded him into the ambulance. The video footage came from 3 separate sources. A security camera mounted on the airport perimeter fence. A phone recording captured by one of the airport workers who had been frozen at the fence line, and the dash cam of a logistics truck parked on the access road. All 3 captured the same sequence of events. A man in a delivery uniform, climbing through a fence, crossing open ground toward a burning aircraft, entering the wreckage, emerging with a child, going back in, emerging a second time supporting an injured woman, turning into a window blast to shield her. The footage circulated by the following morning and did not stop. By 48 hours later, Ethan Cole's name was everywhere. His face calm and soot-streaked and completely unremarkable in its lack of performance was on the front page of newspapers in 11 countries. People who did not know him described him as a hero. People who did know him, meaning a handful of former colleagues and a daycare teacher named Mrs. Burrows, said, "Yes, that sounds right. That's just Ethan." The investigation was faster than anyone expected, driven partly by the public attention and partly by the fact that the evidence had been sitting in internal company servers for 3 months, filed and ignored, and carefully not acted upon. The fault in the auxiliary fuel line routing had been identified precisely as Ethan's report had described, and the contracted safety team sign-off was traced to a document that had been reviewed for a total of 40 minutes before approval. Emails surfaced. A chain of internal communication from the week after Ethan's submission showed 2 senior executives acknowledging the risk assessment and then discussing, in corporate language, so careful it was almost beautiful, the financial consequences of a launch delay versus the statistical probability of a catastrophic failure. They had done the math and decided to proceed. Victoria Hale was not copied on those specific emails. That distinction would matter, legally. It did not make her feel better. She lay in her hospital room, fractured tibia, lacerations requiring 20 stitches, mild smoke inhalation, and read the printouts her legal team brought her, and something moved through her that she did not have a name for yet, but that pressed against the backs of her eyes, until she had to put the papers down and look at the ceiling for a while. The email chain was only 6 messages long. It had taken the 2 executives fewer than 48 hours to assess the risk, decide it was acceptable, and move on. 48 hours to make the decision that had resulted in the crash, the fire, the child trapped in the wreckage, and Ethan Cole standing in the burning cabin with his hand against the wall, calculating the angle of force required to free her. She had created the environment in which that decision was possible. She had hired those executives, set the culture, established the launch timeline, and made absolutely clear in ways she had never needed to state aloud, because effective leaders never had to state their priorities aloud, that the deadline was the priority. She could trace every step of the chain back to herself without difficulty. It was the most honest accounting she had done in years, and it cost her more than any quarterly report ever had. Something moved through her that she did not have a name for yet, but it was close to the thing she had sealed off at 12 years old, When her father had told her that attachment was a debt, she had kept that seal intact for 23 years. It was no longer intact. She had not cried since her father's funeral. She did not cry now, but it was close. Victoria Hale had grown up in a house where emotion was treated as a liability. Her father, Richard Hale, had built the original Hale Industries from a regional machine parts supplier into a mid-sized defense contractor through a combination of ruthless cost discipline and a complete indifference to the feelings of anyone who worked for him. He was not cruel in any dramatic sense. He did not shout or demean or humiliate, at least not habitually. But he had an absolute faith in the principle that softness was fatal, that any allowance made for sentiment was a crack in the foundation that would eventually split the whole structure. He had raised Victoria on this principle the way other fathers raised children on religion, with complete conviction, consistent example, and no tolerance for apostasy. When she was 12 and came home from school having cried over a falling out with her best friend, he had sat her down and said, in the same tone he used for quarterly financial reviews, "Attachment is a debt. The more you owe, the more it costs when it's called." She had not made many close friends after that. It was easier. The math was cleaner. She had applied his theorem to everything and found that it worked, in the way that certain kinds of efficient machines work, producing results, operating without friction, requiring very little maintenance beyond fuel and forward momentum. She had graduated top of her business program, taken the company at 28 when her father's health declined, and rebuilt it as Hale Aerospace within 4 years. She was good at it. She was extraordinary at it. She never allowed herself to wonder what it was costing, because that particular line of inquiry was the crack in the foundation her father had warned her about, and she had sealed it years ago and never looked at it again. She had no family of her own, no partner, no children, no household beyond an expensive and largely impersonal apartment that her assistant maintained. She had colleagues, advisors, legal counsel, security staff, a publicist, a personal shopper, and 2 drivers. She had no one who would come to the hospital at 2 in the morning simply because she was there. She had her assistant obtain Ethan's hospital room number. She went on the second day, still on crutches, without her legal team, without a prepared statement. She stood in the corridor outside his door for 4 minutes. She could hear, through the partially open door, a child's voice, bright, cheerful, narrating something with great enthusiasm. She heard Ethan's voice respond, lower, warm, the tone of a person who has set everything else down and is simply present. Victoria stood in the corridor and listened to this ordinary sound, a father and a daughter talking in a hospital room, and felt something she could not calculate or leverage or convert into a line item. She turned around. She walked back to the elevator. She did not go in. She learned about the drawing from Lily's teacher, Mrs. Burroughs, who had been quoted in a news article about the rescue. A reporter had asked what kind of man Ethan Cole was, and Mrs. Burroughs had mentioned the sketchbook, the drawings Lily made, always the same figure in a uniform in front of a large airplane, and the label written below it in a child's handwriting, "My hero." Victoria's assistant printed the article and left it on her desk without comment. Victoria read it twice. Then she sat alone in her office. She had insisted on returning to the building, crutches and all, because stillness felt dangerous, and looked out at the city through the glass and understood, for the first time, that she had spent 15 years accumulating things that could be measured and had never once considered the things that could not. Her father had built the company on a single principle. That sentiment was inefficiency dressed up in human clothing, and that the fastest way to lose everything was to let it matter. She had believed him. She had made herself into living proof of his theorem. She was very good at it. She was extraordinarily alone because of it. And the man she had publicly humiliated and discarded, whose career she had ended, and whose name she had allowed to be dragged through every closed door in the industry, that man had walked into a burning aircraft to pull out a child and then come back for her. Not because she deserved it. There was no version of any equation in which she deserved it. The board acted within the week. They did what boards do when the story has turned against them, and the liability is visible, and the legal exposure is concrete. They identified a target, built a narrative, and pushed it toward the public. Ethan Cole, the story went, had been a disgruntled former employee with a known grievance against the company. His so-called safety report had been reviewed and found to be technically overstated, motivated by personal animus, rather than genuine engineering concern. His presence at the crash site, the footage, the rescue was being framed, in careful language, as the opportunistic action of someone who wanted to leverage a tragedy for personal rehabilitation. The press picked it up, some of it, anyway. Enough. Ethan's name began appearing in opinion columns with qualifiers attached: alleged hero, so-called whistleblower, the architecture of doubt being assembled brick by brick in the days when he was still in a hospital bed with bandaged hands, and his daughter beside him drawing airplanes in her sketchbook. Victoria saw the narrative being constructed. She had constructed enough of them herself to recognize the machinery. She sat in the board meeting where the strategy was presented and said nothing for the first 40 minutes, which was unusual enough that the room grew slightly watchful. When she finally spoke, she said, "I want the full internal communication record from the 3 weeks following Cole's safety report prepared for external release." The room went very quiet. The lead counsel said that would be inadvisable in the current legal climate. Victoria said, "I understand." Then she said, "Do it anyway." There were voices raised. There were arguments, professional, strategic, financial, legal, the full weight of institutional self-preservation arrayed on one side of the table. Victoria sat at the head of it and felt, for the first time in memory, entirely certain. Not certain because the math worked. Certain because the alternative was to sit in a room and watch a man who had saved her life be destroyed by people who had almost killed her. And she understood now that there were things she could not do. This, it turned out, was one of them. She authorized the release. She drafted a public statement, in her own words. Without legal polish, without strategic softening, she stated that Ethan Cole had filed a technically accurate and urgent safety report that the company had failed to act on. She stated that she had terminated his employment in a manner that was unjust and professionally damaging. She stated that he had returned to the crash site not for any calculated reason but because that was the kind of man he was, and that she was alive because of it. And then she said the thing that the room had been holding its breath to hear: "He saved my life after I destroyed his." The board voted to remove her as CEO 4 days later. She had expected it. She had already made her peace with it. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and expensive, and ultimately resulted in findings against 2 senior executives and the contracted safety team. Ethan received a formal settlement that covered the damages from his wrongful termination, and used it without extravagance, a slightly larger apartment for him and Lily, the kind with a kitchen window that overlooked a park instead of a parking lot. Lily immediately began covering the new walls with drawings. It did not take long. Ethan testified before a congressional subcommittee on aviation safety in February. He was precise, measured, technical. He spoke about fuel line routing and thermal stress models and regulatory gap analysis. And the subcommittee members listened in the particular silence of people who have realized they are in the presence of someone who actually understands what they are talking about. One senator asked him, near the end of the session, whether he felt vindicated. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I feel like we now have better rules. That's what matters." His testimony led directly to 3 new mandatory review protocols being incorporated into private aviation certification standards. He did not give a speech about what he had been through. He gave answers about structural engineering. It was, somehow, more powerful. The public apology came on a Saturday afternoon, in person, in the small park 2 blocks from Ethan's apartment where Lily liked to feed the pigeons. Victoria had called ahead a brief, careful phone call in which she had said only that she would like to speak with him if he was willing, and that she understood completely if he was not. He had said yes, after a pause long enough that she had begun composing the words she would say if he said no. She arrived without staff, without a car service, in a coat that was not particularly expensive, her hair down in a way the cameras had never seen. He was sitting on a bench near the fountain. Lily was chasing pigeons 15 feet away, entirely absorbed. Victoria sat down on the bench. She did not prepare a preamble. She said, "I was wrong." Nothing more. No qualification, no context, no pivot toward the future. Just those three words, sitting in the air between them like something that had needed to be said for a very long time. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lily, who had stopped chasing pigeons and was watching Victoria with the frank, unedited curiosity of an 8-year-old. He said, "She asks about you sometimes. Lily, she thinks you were very brave in the fire." Victoria looked at the child. Lily waved, completely without self-consciousness. Victoria lifted her hand and waved back, and something in her face shifted in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching carefully. Ethan watched it happen. He said, quietly, "I forgive you," not in the tone of someone granting a favor, in the tone of someone completing a transaction that only hurt themselves to leave open. He said, "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for her. I don't want her growing up thinking that holding on to anger is the same as being strong." Victoria came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. Not with any plan, she would not have known how to describe what she was doing, if someone had asked. She brought Lily a book about aerodynamics the third week, pitched for 10-year-olds. With illustrations, she had spent an embarrassing amount of time selecting. Lily read the first chapter on the park bench, while the adults sat on either side of her and actually talked, for the first time, without the buffer of an agenda or a power differential about the things they had wanted that had not turned out the way they had imagined, about what it costs to be good at your work and nothing else, about what a person is left with when the things they built their identity around are stripped away. Victoria had not spoken to anyone this way in a long time, possibly ever. She found it uncomfortable in the way that true things sometimes are. She came back anyway. Lily, for her part, absorbed Victoria with the same frank and systematic attention she applied to everything new. She asked questions that adults never would: why Victoria didn't have any kids, whether she liked dogs, what her favorite color was, whether she had ever flown in the plane that crashed. She asked these without ceremony, as if they were obvious things to want to know. And she absorbed the answers with equal matter-of-factness. Victoria answered all of them, finding, to her own mild surprise, that she did not find the questions intrusive. She found them clarifying. Nobody in her professional life had asked what her favorite color was in 15 years. The answer, it turned out, was dark green. She had not thought about it until Lily asked. On the 5th Saturday, Lily brought Victoria into the apartment to show her a drawing she was working on, still in progress. The careful ambition of it visible in the pencil lines and the multiple erased attempts around the edges of the paper. It was a new scene, 2 figures standing together in front of an airplane, both of them looking up at the sky, and between them a smaller figure holding both their hands. Below it, in Lily's deliberate printing, it said, "Us." Victoria stood in the kitchen of the small apartment, surrounded by years of Lily's drawings covering every wall, and looked at the picture for a long time. She said, "Can I have this one when you're done?" Lily considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "You can have it now. I'll do another one." Victoria folded it very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to where it needed to be. One evening, sitting at Ethan's small kitchen table while Lily showed her the nearly complete drawing, a new one, this time featuring 2 figures in front of an airplane, both of them pointing at the sky, Victoria said, "I want to build something honest. Will you help me?" Ethan looked at the drawing. Then he looked at her. "What kind of something?" "An aviation company. Safety first. Not as a slogan, as the actual operating principle. No launch without full independent certification. Full transparency on all technical reviews. Every engineer who raises a concern gets heard. Every concern gets a written response. No exceptions, no timeline pressure, no boardroom math that treats a human life as an acceptable variable." He was quiet for a moment. "That'll take longer to get off the ground." "I know. It won't be as profitable at first." I know that too. He said. Okay. 12 months later, Colehale Aviation held a small private ceremony to mark the completion of its first aircraft, a mid-range charter model designated the CH-1. The guest list was 32 people. Engineers, safety inspectors, the congressional aide who had helped draft the new certification protocols, Mrs. Burroughs from Lily's school, and Lily herself, who wore a dress with small airplane prints on it that she had chosen herself and considered very appropriate for the occasion. The ceremony was held at a regional airfield, under clear morning sky, the kind of pale winter blue that looked like the first draft of something. There was no press. Victoria had insisted on that. Ethan had agreed without argument. He had never wanted to be watched, only to do the work. The CH-1 sat on the tarmac in the thin early light, white with a dark blue stripe along the fuselage, smaller than the HA-7 and entirely unlike it in every way that mattered. The fuel line routing had been independently reviewed 4 times. The emergency exit mechanisms had been tested at 300% of rated load. Every component had a paper trail that could be followed from raw material to final installation. Every safety finding, every one, no matter how minor, had been resolved before the aircraft advanced to the next phase. It had taken 14 months longer than originally projected. It had cost 30% more than the initial budget. It was, Ethan had said at the last engineering review, the safest aircraft of its class that he had ever worked on. He had said it without ceremony, the way engineers say things when they are simply true. Nobody had applauded. The entire engineering team had simply nodded, quietly and collectively. And that nod had meant more than any applause or headline ever could have. Victoria had changed in ways she was still mapping. She had stopped speaking in the precise, cultivated language she had developed over 15 years of corporate presentation, not because it was wrong, but because she had discovered that speaking plainly was more efficient, and efficiency had always been her native value. She had begun reading things for reasons other than competitive advantage, which was new. She had started sleeping more than 5 hours a night, which was also new, and she had noticed that the world looked slightly different when she was not running on stimulants and deadline pressure. She called her company's engineers by their first names, which was new, and stopped them in hallways to ask genuine questions about technical problems, which surprised them so much the first several times that they had visibly braced for a reprimand. She was not the same person who had stood in that boardroom and told Ethan Cole that people like him were why companies failed. She was something in progress, still being shaped by events she had not chosen and consequences she had not anticipated, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind this. Being unfinished had a quality she had never allowed herself before. It felt, against all expectation, like something to look forward to. On the morning of the CH-1's maiden flight, Ethan stood on the tarmac with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the aircraft taxi toward the runway. The burned scars on his right forearm were visible above his wrist. They would always be visible. The skin there had rewritten itself in a different texture, pale and smooth in the cold air. He had stopped being self-conscious about them. They were just part of the record now. Victoria stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, watching the same aircraft. Lily stood on his left, her hand in his, craning her neck to follow the plane as it turned onto the runway and held position. The engines rose to full power. The CH-1 began to roll. Lily's grip tightened. Victoria said, without looking at him, looking at the aircraft, watching it gather speed, watching it lift, you ran into fire for someone who ruined your life. It was not a question. It was the thing she had been trying to understand for 12 months, turning it over from different angles, still unable to make it fit any model of human behavior she had been taught to expect. Ethan watched the wheels leave the ground. He watched the plane climb clean and steady, the nose rising into that pale winter blue. He said, "No child deserves to lose a parent." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the nod of someone receiving information that reorganizes something fundamental. The CH-1 climbed higher. It did not vanish into the sky so much as it was absorbed by it, the white of the fuselage, softening into the blue, becoming part of a larger thing. Lily watched until she could not see it anymore, then looked up at her father. "Is it safe?" she asked. Yes, he said. I checked it myself. She considered this. Then she looked at Victoria, and with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has decided a thing, she took Victoria's hand with her free one and held both at once. None of them spoke. The sky above the airfield was enormous and pale and empty and entirely quiet. The aircraft already gone from sight, carrying nothing but the weight of everything that had been done right. Some things cannot be bought. Not with $5 billion, not with stock options, not with titles or leverage, or the particular power that comes from never being the one who needs anything. A man who makes $14 an hour and buys asthma medication on a payment plan and pins his daughter's drawings above a kitchen table in a small apartment that man had something the balance sheet had no column for. He had walked into a burning aircraft because a child was crying. He had pulled out the woman who destroyed him because leaving her there was simply not something he was willing to become. He had absorbed the blast and taken the burn and gotten them both out. And then, his first words had been about his daughter. That is the kind of detail that tells you everything about a person, not the action itself, which was extraordinary. But what came after it, which was ordinary in the most profound possible way. He was not thinking about justice or vindication or the years of injustice that had preceded the moment. He was thinking about Lily. There is a kind of strength that announces itself, that curates its image, that ensures the narrative is controlled. It arrives with a team and a press strategy, and a carefully composed statement, and then there is the other kind, the kind that acts and does not wait to see how it lands, that does right without an audience, that burns its hand and asks about its child. That kind is rarer. It cannot be manufactured or reverse engineered or acquired through any transaction. It grows slowly, in small apartments with thin walls, in the dark of parking lots at 2 in the morning. In the careful reading of bedtime stories, in a voice that is trying very hard to stay steady. It is built, without anyone watching. From all the small choices made correctly, when no one was keeping score, the choice to file the report, the choice to escalate it, the choice to file again with the regulatory authority, even when every door had been closed, the choice to run toward the fire. None of those choices were heroic in the moment they were made. They were simply what a person of that particular character did when confronted with a situation that required them. The heroism was not in any single action. It was in the kind of person that had been built, day by day and year by year, by all the small decisions that came before. The plane was in the sky. The morning was cold and clear, and on the tarmac, holding two hands that had never expected to be held, a little girl looked up at a horizon that was wider than it had been before, and she did not yet have the words for what she was looking at, but she would grow into them. She already had everything she needed.